Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us on this Christmas Eve and this third night of Hanukkah. We are going to do something special this evening. We're going to have a focus on religion, morality, our current national discord. And to do that, we will be joined by a very special holiday panel from the First Baptist Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. The Reverend Dr. Thomas Nins is here, and from Temple Shaaray Tefila in Bedford Corners, New York, about 30 miles north of New York City, Rabbi Nevarez. He's with us. Both will also share their holiday message for their congregations and for us all. And joining them, a familiar face, senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman. Let's begin right now here. We're going to get, in addition this hour, to the very latest when we come to impeachment, as well as also look at how the process may play out in the coming year. It's an educated guess. We'll also do a deep dive into holiday movies, classics, what should be part of the holidays, and also debate about what actually makes a holiday movie. I know Die Hard, believe it or not, it's in the debate. Plus, we're going to take you to holiday celebrations in the moving ways people just like you are making a difference in making the holiday memories that will last a lifetime. Hopefully, we'll leave you with a smile on your face this Christmas Eve. Not too many RFLs lately are in that vein, but let's start here where we are in this country right now. It's a divided nation. The sense of unity, hard to come by more often than not. Ask just about anybody, regardless of political orientation, religion, ethnicity, income level. It seems at least undeniable that Americans in this Christmas season more divided and more angry than at any time that at least I can remember in recent memory. There is the rhetoric, the culture of division, much of it framed as a fight between them and us, depending on who the them and the us is for you. We see it every day in politics and even public lives. Tens of thousands of angry people in red hats jammed into Trump rallies, many prodded and poked into feeling that the nation is changing without them and leaving them and their sense of security behind. In their anger, it used to promote the politicians who pledged to stop that change, while tens of thousands more protest against that movement, demanding impeachment, demanding a focus on individual rights, at-risk groups feeling that they themselves are the ones being targeted. And their anger used to promote the politicians who pledged to continue the changes that the others rally against. And there, in the center of that, the White House spotlight is none other than this man, our President Donald J. Trump, who has converted that sense of aggrievement into a political movement that has rarely been seen in our nation's history, and it's fueled by a desire to hurt and to use the sensitivity of others as a weapon for himself and arguably supporters. Now, while we cannot hold the president certainly personally responsible for all the anger that seems to be out there right now, the rise of Trump certainly, I think we'd all agree, has seen a corresponding rise in that anger and even some of the data when it relates to hate crimes. A recent FBI report on hate crimes registered at 16-year high in this nation in 2018. Hate-fueled assaults and intimidation attacks, they're also on the rise, even as other crime rates continue to fall. And those hate crimes, they're shifting away from attacks on property to assaults on individuals. And among those groups being increasingly targeted, Latinos, Muslims, Arab Americans, transgender people, and Jews. A rising culture of hate that our president has failed to tamp down and may, some argue, have helped fuel.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
We are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks, and the numbers are indisputable. It's up 28% nationwide just between the years 2015 and 2018. It's up 51% in New York City, the city with the second largest Jewish population in the world. Overall, the nation saw fewer anti-Semitic incidents in 2018 than 17, but the numbers are still way up in recent years. And we have seen how that spike has manifested itself. Events like the synagogue attack in Pittsburgh, as the president sows even more division, conflating the politics of Israel with the religion of Jews in ways that many Jews find offensive and worry normalizing his brand of labeling.
You have people that are Jewish people that are great people. They don't love Israel enough. You know that.
And from Trump it spreads. In a new interview out today, Rudy Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani says he's more Jewish than George Soros, a Democratic donor vilified by the right. I should also mention George Soros, a Holocaust survivor. While at the same time, Judaism and Islam are under increasing attacks in the country, Christianity has become a weapon of its own, with an evangelical community seemingly in lockstep with the president, bonded by a shared sense of perceived persecution.
They were trying to take Christmas out of Christmas, you remember? They didn't want to let you say Merry Christmas. You'd go around, you'd see department stores that have everything red, snow, beautiful, ribbons, bows. Everything was there, but they wouldn't say Merry Christmas. They're all saying Merry Christmas again.
Thank him for that. Now, yet, when a leading Christian magazine calls for the president's impeachment, arguing his actions are not only a violation of the Constitution, but more importantly, it is profoundly immoral, that argument falls flat for many who are all in on a demonstrably immoral president who they claim champions their moral code. And with that as our backdrop, let's bring in our panel. And I'll start with you, Reverend. It's not my impression, is it, Rabbi, that there's more tension. I'm curious, even when you talk to the congregation here, not that you always want to wade into politics, certainly, but you must avoid things like a third rail here because it takes so little to set so many off.
Absolutely. I think we're living in a divisive world, and especially in our local community, we're branded as a purple community in which we have those on the right and those on the left, and trying to find ways to bring synergies into their world and into the synagogue community, into the faith community, has been increasingly more challenging. And it becomes the number one thing that we try to work at each and every day to figure out how we're going to bring people together. And so the issues have been about trying to figure out which ways we look at the morality and the fabric of the communities in which we live. What are we trying to promote to our children? What are we trying to enhance in their lives to show that the challenges that are taking place in Washington that have, in a sense, branded our country and have increased the anti-Semitic rhetoric and the language and the ways in which we relate to one another, those are the ways we're trying to temper in our own local communities. And I think it becomes harder with each passing day. But what I can tell you is that the morality goalpost has shifted. We've moved it in a way down the road to allow to embrace those things that normal people of faith would not excuse as permissible. And so with that, we try to combat that reality along with trying to counterbalance what is the essence of our faith.
And you always have an interesting perspective when we get into these spots because, and folks may or may not remember, but you both work with law enforcement. And you also work with a congregation that's heavily African American. We've seen in the headlines just recently where the president told law enforcement basically rough somebody up when you put them in a squad car. You had the attorney general doing a speech that if law enforcement doesn't feel appreciated enough in certain communities, and we know what communities he was talking about, then maybe they shouldn't go there or shouldn't treat those people or respond to those calls if they weren't. I can just imagine when you talk to the different populations that things are made more difficult by some of the comments that you would hope would ease some of the tensions. It's almost like they're stoking some of the fires.
I would agree, and thank you for having me. It's good to be back. There's a complexity with this guy. And I think that he strategically is either a genius or just an idiot savant. If I'm a tyrant, if I want ultimate control, what I want to do is set every faction around me against each other. He has marvelously done that. On any given day, he's going to turn any part of the population against one another to keep the focus on his incompetence. And so with law enforcement, and most recently we had a terrible shooting of Jews and police officers. Rarely would you see a gunman say, I have an issue with Jews and police officers. And so there's great chaos in the land. And I think you ought to trademark the rise of Trump. It sounds like the next Star Wars series to come down the road. There is evil in the land.
You know, Andrew, we admittedly, and I think we're in the vast majority, even for folks who voted for Trump, did not see 2016 happening. We didn't think that he was going to win on election night. We've seen recent interviews where both Hillary and him both said that they were surprised by the returns. That said, in the last 3 years, more so than what he has said and what he's done, I've been shocked at we the people, where it's almost as if a scab was pulled back and a part of the country, a much bigger part of the country, wants to be mad, wants to pick shirts and skins that he obviously knew existed and I underestimated. Are you surprised also how little it's taken to just put it all out in the open?
I'm not surprised by how little it's taken. I am surprised by the lack of pushback or the sort of wider sense that this is what's happening. I think the Reverend was actually absolutely right that his MO is about dividing us into individual groups so that those individual groups can then feel like their needs or desires have been overlooked or being trampled by everybody else. And so that defensive mechanism becomes a power or a method of control for him. If everybody's in a group and every group feels that they're being persecuted, then there's reason for everybody to be upset. That hasn't surprised me because that's been the history of the world up until present day and continuing. What surprised me is that nobody has taken a step back, or very few people have, and said, this is what he's doing. And it's not, it almost feels in many ways like the religious aspect of his arguments are incidental. It's just another way of dividing everybody. And so it surprises me that people haven't called that out and that we haven't sort of taken that wider angle look at it and pushed back on that basis.
We've spoken to folks with direct connections to that synagogue in Pittsburgh. And more than the horror of that day, the intent of that day, and the aftermath, is that they believe that it can happen to their house of worship. Absolutely. And they believe that they never thought of that before. But conversations about armed guards in front of the synagogues for high holy days, and not just limited to synagogues, I should mention, but what have been some of the conversations? More than just the security, but that there are people who want to hate us and hurt us because of what we believe.
I think the conversation is not new. I think it's been unearthed in the era of Trump. I think that we've always had a watchful eye on our backs to note that there have been individuals who want us gone or want us out. That has been throughout Jewish civilization. I think what makes it more amplified at this time are the guns that are being used, the spontaneous language that's being, and the vitriol that's being used from the White House, and that trickles down into normal day Americans who think they have permission and the liberty to do what they do to trample on the innocence and the freedoms that we are provided as Americans. And what I can say in regard to the security, it has been amplified in our congregations. We have now armed guards at every single service and major experience that we have in our congregation. This is, we never thought possible that when we enter into a Sabbath that we would have to think about who's at the front door or who's guarding us and who's watching our backs while we have the opportunity to be in prayerful moments and expression with one another.
If President Trump is throwing around stereotypes like Jews and money or Jews in Israel, and he uses them almost as a punchline, what's to stop somebody else from doing so without necessarily using it for the same reasons the president is? I mean, then it just becomes normalized hate and becomes problematic going forward. And it's not just Jews, it's other groups too.
Well, Reverend, I'm curious. When you talk to the different populations that you do you intentionally either try to include subject matter that, you know, is in the, you know, floodgates of news that come out every day? Or do you look at your house of worship as a refuge where they're bombarded by that? And we're going to talk about something else, something that at least we can all share. How do you navigate that?
So it's interesting. Rabbi just asked me that before the show started. Yes, I address it within the sanctuary. Churches, houses of worship, spiritually, we offer ourselves as a sanctuary, as a refuge. But even within the sanctuary, there is the remnant of the things that the people are trying to come away from. And so we cannot not address those things. Something that you talked about earlier, I just want to come back to it, and that is who speaks out, who will speak up about these things. Ironically, and for whatever reason, the evangelical church became the church of presidents or the church of administration, going back to Billy Graham. And one of the things that outraged so many people of faith is that at this particular time, with this particular president, the evangelical church was silent, and silence sometimes looks like an endorsement. And so people were wondering, why weren't they saying anything? And it becomes more complicated when you add to that the idea that had this been the prior president doing these things and saying these things, then the evangelical representatives would have been all over that.
And just to me, the thing that, and I come from the Catholic wing of this, is regardless of who the president is, the church always feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And we have seen policies beyond the rhetoric that literally cutting school lunches for kids, cutting funding here, making it a requirement that never existed before to help the most vulnerable in the populations. I'm not trying to even get into a whole political peroration, but frankly, it's the houses of worship that I thought under that rubric would have said, uniformly, this is not what we stand for. No faith, every faith looks out for the most vulnerable, but it has been that silent, to what Andrew had said, that lack of pushback to say there's a line we can't cross. And I keep waiting for that because I think that would be a powerful statement, that people go to different houses of worship on Saturdays or Sundays or whatever the case may be, and they look for not political direction necessarily, but they look for this is morally what we all can agree on. And I think, to your guys' point, that's been tough sometimes to find. All right, stay with me, guys, because when we come back, we are going to pivot from where we are now to also what messages these gentlemen share with their congregations and what hopefulness we can look forward to as we go very closely to 2020. We'll be right back with that and much more after this.